I'm a classicist, and as classicist, I'm in the privileged position to deal with texts that became the model or even paradigm for most work of later periods. Greek poetry, Greek philosophy, Greek art is something no age could ignore. My field is ancient philosophy, and in this, during this stay at Morphomata in Cologne, I pursued two major projects. One was the revision of a translation of Aristotle's Politics. When translating, the translator comes across a serious problem, in particular if one deals with philosophy of politics. Should one try to make the impression that Aristotle spoke to us as if he had been invited to give a lecture in 2012 in Cologne? Or should we express the fact that this is a text going back 2,500 years, dealing with a society which is very different from our modern society? I think a translator has to do both. He has to make a translation that is readable, and at the same time he should make sure that the author realizes we are not dealing, let's say, with Greece of 2012. I pursued that aspect of translation as well from a theoretically historical context. I gave the Morphomata lecture on the earliest translations of Aristotle's Politics and the creation of political terminology. In this lecture, I pursued the early medieval and the first humanist translations of Aristotle's Politics. In particular, I focused on the Chancellor and humanist of Florence, Leonardo Bruni, who in the early 14th century produced the first translation of Aristotle, which tried to meet the standards of good Latin, that means Ciceronian Latin. Bruni wrote as well a theoretical treatise with the title De Recta Translatione, that means making it clear there is one way of doing it right when translating, and he had his medieval predecessors in mind when he said they did not translate right. The second aspect of my work and the second focus is a collection of fragments of Aristotle's political and historical works. This seems to be a very philological work, but it is actually more interesting. In recent times, fragments are no longer edited under the title of the original, of which we have only a few scraps, but we deal with fragments as an example of the different times and the way Aristotle, or whoever it is reflected in these times. For that reason, the organization of these fragments is according to the time in which these fragments were written or remembered by later authors. In this way, we gain an impression in the various interests in Aristotle during different times. In late antiquity, the interest is very different than in Byzantine times. And one sad aspect actually in this area is to realize how little anyone cared about Aristotle's Aristotle's political philosophy. What they cared about is explanation of individual worlds, or they cared about curiosities. For instance, when something, a strange event was remembered. They cared about geography, but the core of Aristotle's political philosophy became or was not of any interest for almost 1500 years. So the collection of fragments shows what Aristotle meant to posterity. Fortunately, it is different with in other areas. I'm the editor, a co-editor of the whole series of fragments to be published by De Gruyter, and in other areas, in rhetoric, in poetry, in metaphysics, and so on, Aristotle found much more interest in later times than we have this for politics and history. My stay at Morphomata was very fruitful. I had the leisure to focus on things which I would not have had, and I'm much closer to completion of this work than I